Welcome back to Bombastic Nation and Ting and Ting and Ting. I'm Mr. Giant and I'm back with some more vibes for you. And we're going to do a little American history here. And this one is called The Trail of Tears, the Cherokee short history documentary. And the Trail of Tears is where the Native Americans were forced marched to undesirable land as the Europeans move in there and thing, So we're gonna take a look at this and see how this all played out. All right, let's go ahead and YouTube and simmer.
At the turn of the 19th century, an estimated 125,000 Native Americans lived on lands in Alabama.
That's more than how many people was in my country.
And these lands had been inhabited for time immemorial. By the mid-1800s, very few indigenous Americans remained in these territories. The federal government of the United States forced thousands of natives on arduous marches that crossed the Mississippi River into new territories further east. Many would not survive this journey as room was made for the growing United States, often to create.
I think that was planned. You know what I mean? That forced march was planned. Survival of the fittest within the indigenous people. The less of them there are, the less revolt there would be. It's a breaking of the will. You take somebody off their land that they've been on there for years, and they can't really do anything about it, and they have to like do as you say. That breaks the will too. You know what I mean? It's good, and it does because they still live on reservations as of today as we speak. And I guess it's so that they could have their own autonomy, but still, they were broken. And there is that a psychological part to it too. You treat them like that, they're gonna be broken. So I'm assuming that had a lot to do with the marches. You know what I mean? They break them, and they take their land. That's crazy.
Cotton plantations or taking over lands that had been cultivated by the tribes. We will focus on the Cherokee people and their removal from Georgia. Official reports at the time stated that 400 people had died. However, in reality, the number was actually around 4,000 people, which equated to 25% of the population. In today's video, we will cover the events that led up to the Trail of Tears and what the people went through during this period. It is perhaps helpful to start with the situation for the Cherokee. The difference in cultures between the indigenous and European Americans was a constant source of problems, especially in the frontiers. But the Cherokee had little issue with this, having become largely integrated with the European Americans, in part due to the trade between the two groups. The Cherokee people were recognized as an independent nation, had their own written constitution and written language, a bilingual newspaper, and higher literacy rates than most at the time. In the 1930s, the Cherokee Nation numbered 16,500 Cherokee, 200 in.
That's interesting there because where I live here, everybody is part Cherokee. I ain't even joking you. Almost everybody you speak to here says that their great grandmother was Cherokee or something like that. You know what I mean? So, but then they did say that they were partially integrated into the European style of living. So that would explain why so many people would think that they are part Cherokee. But I don't think they know that part of history because I didn't know that they were integrated, the Cherokee that is. That's why they probably lasted longer than most, and the idea of them still remain in today's society. So that explains that right there. They did have some sort of integration, some sort of assimilation, even though keeping their own constitution and stuff like they said here, and being like a separate nation. Let's keep watching.
16,500 Cherokee, 200 intermarried European Americans, and around 1,600 slaves. Many of these indigenous Americans had settled homes, were taking part in forms of government, had enrolled their children into missionary schools, or were engaged in industries other than agriculture. The Cherokee were part of 5 civilized tribes. along with the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Creek. Much like the Cherokee, these tribes attempted to assimilate in some way with the European Americans. However, there were those who wished to remove the Native American tribes and occupy their land. In 1828, prospectors struck gold on Cherokee lands, which in
Gold
turn
now.
drew more and more
Money to
people
be
the
made.
area in hopes they too could strike gold. Many of these prospectors trespassed onto Cherokee land and often caused violent disputes. These disputes only pushed the desire to remove the Cherokee peoples from their land as soon as possible. In addition to the gold, valuable farming land and developments in harvesting cotton also made the area desirable for those wishing to monopolize and expand the industry. In May of 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. The act gave powers to grant the indigenous Americans land in the western prairies and east of the Mississippi River, often to Oklahoma, which was seen as worthless due to the difficulties in establishing farms. This would be in exchange for their highly desired ancestral lands. In June of 1830, the Cherokee elected leadership under Chief John Ross submitted their complaint to the Supreme Court that Georgia had passed laws that prohibited non-Cherokee persons to live on Cherokee lands without obtaining approval from the state. Georgia for a time had been pushing for the removal of the Cherokee people from Georgia, but with little success, and it is thought that these laws were designed to exert pressure to concede agreeing to the removal. The Cherokee Nation looked to obtain a federal injunction from Georgia on these laws, but the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. It instead ruled that it had no jurisdiction to hear the case from the Cherokee Nation, as it was deemed as an independent nation with a relationship to the United States akin to that of a ward to its guardian. Instead, a Christian missionary named Samuel Worcester brought the case as he had been convicted by Georgia of living on Cherokee land without a license. In this case, Georgia was ruled to have created an unconstitutional law and was a key step in establishing the nation of tribal sovereignty. However, there was little enforcement of this decision, and Samuel was not released from prison until January of 1833. Andrew Jackson made little efforts to enforce the decision, and instead continued with his policy of Native American removal. He is often attributed with a quote stating that if the Supreme Court made their decision, they can enforce it, not him. In a meeting with Jackson shortly after the case, John Ridge, a clerk of the Cherokee National Council, inquired whether Jackson would use the power of the federal
See, they're already
government
wearing
against
European
Georgia.
clothes.
Jackson confirmed he had no such intention, and instead reiterated that the Cherokee Nation should accept that they were to be removed from their land and negotiate a treaty, making it clear removal would happen regardless of the Supreme Court's ruling. Whilst the majority of the Cherokee people were opposed to any treaty agreeing to their removal, a small faction emerged that were prepared to accept the terms of the removal treaty.
There's
The
always
Cherokee Party
some.
believed that the treaty was the only way to secure the future of the Cherokee people, even if that meant losing their land. They believed it was better to secure enough compensation for their land and avoid potential violence. Earlier removal of the Creek and Choctaw tribes was seen as examples of what may befall the Cherokee. The Ross Party, led by Chief Ross, were opposed to the notion of removal. Whilst prepared to cede some land, they were only prepared to do so if they could remain in the East and were subject to state law. Such positions were flatly rejected by the United States. Separate negotiations led by both parties continued to seek a solution, but it was in 1835 that the now infamous New Dakota Treaty was ratified. The New Dakota Treaty was negotiated between the United States government and the unelected treaty party. Whilst their intentions can be seen as an attempt to avoid an escalation in the removal dispute and save the Cherokee people, it is important to note that these were not the elected representatives of the Cherokee Nation. The treaty gave the United States government the authority to remove the Cherokee people from the lands and property with a deadline of 2 years, in exchange for land to the west and a monetary compensation. The true elected officials of the Cherokee Nation immediately objected, and the Ross Party set about obtaining signatures in protest of the treaty. In total, Around 15,000 signatures, which was nearly the entirety of the Cherokee people, were obtained and presented to the United States government as proof that those signed the treaty were not representing the Cherokee people. Regardless, the treaty was ratified by the United States despite clear evidence that those who signed it did not have authority to do so. Around 2,000 Cherokee people left their lands voluntarily and traveled westward, the treaty party amongst them. The vast majority did not. 2 days after the deadline to leave had passed, the then President Martin Van Buren ordered the United States Army to forcibly remove any who remained. In May of 1838, General Winfield Scott and some 7,000 soldiers were dispatched.
You know, when you listen to the news and stuff here, you have these donors that I was watching a news program last night, and they were talking about how who really runs the country. What do they call them? The oligarchs. That's what they call them in that news segment I was watching last night. See, the rich people want that land. There's gold on there. The farming and stuff is there. You know, it's not poor people that's coming in there and taking that land. I mean, they're going to be on there because, hey, if they're going to get land, they're going to take land. Everybody wants something. And I'm assuming that's what's going on. But back then, but even now, you have the question to ask, you know, hey, who's really in charge? Is he doing this for the people, or is he doing this for a certain group of people? Who is really pushing this? It would be nice to know what the ordinary people, the poor people, think. Are they thinking, yeah, move those bastards out of there? You know, is that what they're thinking? Or are they thinking, well, wait a minute, no, what's going on here? Because at some point there is some integration going on, and I mean intermarriage and stuff like that. So there's probably going to be people who are die hard against anything that would harm the Cherokee people and stuff like that, or even the whole of the indigenous people. You know, it would be like, I want to delve into that and see how that works out there. Is it similar? Because, you know, I always tell people we ain't really doing anything different. We're using different terminology, and we're using different tactics because we have different technology now to use those different tactics to spread propaganda and to dehumanize people, to make them seem, you know what I mean, like they're not worthy of having what they have. I mean, like, what was it called? The Rosewood Fire or something like that, I do believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. There was a movie about that. I think that the guy that was in Hotel Rwanda was in that movie, I do believe. Was he? Anyway, where they just go in and burn down all the houses of all the former slaves that lived there, or the destroying of Black Wall Street. You know what I mean? So it's not so much so that a lot of it have to do with keeping people where they are. Now, they don't just keep black people where they are, they keep poor white people where they are, because the few that have the money want to keep the money, and they want to have a legacy sent on to the children. You know what I mean? So here we are doing the same thing that people are complaining about now as minorities, back then to those people. So there's a pattern of repeating history going on there. It worked back then, of course it's going to work now. At least that's what they're thinking. Let's keep going.
And some 7,000 soldiers were dispatched to evict those who had refused to comply with the treaty, often at gunpoint. Over the course of a month, 15,000 Cherokee and their 2,000 black slaves were rounded up and sent into holding camps. These were little more than pens, often with little food and supplies. Around 1,000 people died due to the squalid conditions of these camps, as families were ripped from their homes.
Would you consider them concentration camps? I mean, not to draw comparisons, but
transactions were often done at gunpoint. These deals were often very little more than daylight robbery. This, however, was the best case scenario, as more often than not, homes and farms would be ransacked by groups of brigands, who would often follow the soldiers as they removed the Cherokee people. The Cherokee people who were given permission to return home would often find nothing left, and in some cases, even the graves of their loved ones had been dug up and the jewelry or other ornaments stolen from the dead. From these camps, many were loaded into steamboats and trains and sent to the west. Very often, these boats were too small, with families crammed together. The groups of Cherokee were escorted by United States soldiers.
Sounds like a
There were
slave
often
trade type
accounts of
vibe,
the
huh?
officers who would lead the
What
groups
works,
to their
I
new
guess.
lands. A link will be in the description for one such account from Lieutenant Edward Dees. Those who were sent on these initial methods were spared the harsher treatment of those who were sent overland on foot. Those forced to march were sent along the 2,200-mile route, with many of those suffering from illness, cold, and exhaustion. Limited provisions were loaded into wagons. The old, the sick, and the young children would ride in the wagons, while rest would travel on foot. These dire conditions claimed thousands of lives. According to one witness who had come across a group of around 1,000 Cherokee traveling along the Trail of Tears, he saw the following. We found the road literally filled with procession for nearly 3 miles in length. The sick and feeble were carried in wagons. Multitudes go on foot. Even aged females apparently nearly ready to drop in the grave were traveling with heavy burdens, sometimes on the frozen ground with no covering for feet. They buried 14 or 15 at every stopping place. There were protests before the removals as to when the Cherokee could be kicked off their land. They were to be sent away during what was known as the sickness season. This was when it was colder and illnesses would be more common. Due to the freezing temperatures, even obtaining water required cutting through inches of ice. Every aspect of life was made that much harder. Due to the time of the year, the Cherokee were made to vacate. Sleet and snowstorms caused many to develop.
Letting Mother
pneumonia.
Nature do the
Amongst
genocide.
them was Chief John Ross's wife, Quate Ross. She was reported to have given one of the few blankets to a sickly child, leaving herself without any protection. Illnesses resulted in many deaths, made worse by severe exposure. Contagious diseases such as cholera, influenza, dysentery, and tuberculosis were commonplace. Those who died would be buried in shallow graves before the rest of the party would be moved on. One witness to the forced removals was Private John G. Burnett, who recounted his role in 1890. In Burnett's view, the Trail of Tears was the most brutal order in the history of American warfare. As someone who was able to speak Cherokee, he was able to act as an interpreter, but also as a guard. He would witness as many as 20 people dying a night due to exposure, and was involved in an altercation where he stopped another soldier whipping an elderly man to move faster. A link to his account will be in the description, and I strongly recommend you take the time to read it. When they finally reached their prescribed destination, the weary travelers were met by the United States soldiers. Most of the Cherokee went on to settle with those who had already arrived by boat and train, setting up in present-day Oklahoma. There were many European Americans who opposed the removals, a notable example being Davy Crockett. But there were plenty
Davy
of people
Crockett.
who were happy to benefit from the seized land. Reprisals were taken against the group who had signed the Treaty of
Davy
New
Crockett.
Dakota, leading to the assassination of John Ridge and those other unelected people that had doomed so many. On the 22nd of June 1839, a group of 25 Ross Party members attacked John Ridge, his father Major Ridge, and another key member of the Treaty Party, Elias Boudinot. John in particular was dragged from his bed, stabbed 26 times, and then stamped to death, all in front of his family. What is particularly devastating about the Trail of Tears is the demographics of those who died. In general, those who died were those who were not able to keep up with the arduous trek. The main victims were the elderly and the children. This would result in the Cherokee people being largely robbed of their future in their children and their past in losing their elders. The Trail of Tears, which affected the Cherokee people, is but one of many Native American removals. The Treaty of New Dakota may have been signed to avoid dire situations for the Cherokee people, yet through the Trail of Tears, many still suffered and perished. An estimated 4,000 men, women and children. Andrew Jackson's decision to ignore the judiciary and its role as to check his executive power, as well as his Indian removal policies, ought to be remembered. I would strongly recommend you to take the time to read the accounts of those who witnessed and went through the
Definitely, I'm
going
gonna read some of
in a
that.
bid to remember that the events of the past do shape our present and future.
Unfortunately, we keep repeating the same thing over and over and over and over again. You know what I mean? Those who are in power want more, and they'll do more damage than good to certain groups of people, especially if those people are disenfranchised. You know what I'm saying and thing? I mean, even simple things like, okay, there's a big business that wanted to build something there on a place. They say eminent domain, and they tear it down. I was living in a house just up the street here, and the university is growing leaps and bounds. And one day I just heard, hey, they're going to demolish this house. We had to move out like that. So you know what I mean? When money is to be made, it doesn't matter what color you are, what nationality you are. They're gonna bounce you just like that. Well, anyway, man, if you guys made it this far to the video, go ahead and subscribe. If you're not subscribed, hit the notification button, all right? And drop comments in the comment section. Let me know what you think of all of this, and also suggest some more things that I could watch here and react to, because I'm just trying to learn, all right? And leave a link in the description to this video. As you can tell, they have a wide variety of things on this channel. The short history, I guess that's what the channel is called. I'm gonna have to look that up, but yeah, I'm gonna have to look it up and think, you know what I mean? You know, I just sit down and watch videos, you know, that's what I do, you know what I mean? I don't sit down and plan and have a plan on it. I just sit down and watch videos, you know, because I want the first impression of what I see to be lasting, you know what I mean, and to understand, and then I'll go read, and you should too, more accounts, eyewitness accounts, politicians accounts, you know, religious people accounts of what happened in any historical context. But thank you all for watching this with me. You all take care of each other, all right? Cool runnings.